Greetings. I'm so happy to initiate our 10th season of First Wednesday Lectures, following this fantastic weekend of the 14th annual Brattleboro Literary Festival, where we had 5 sessions in this very room that attracted nearly 500 people. So it was a great event, and it was that way throughout the town. And I'm so happy to have our friend from the South, Illan Stavans, South that is in Amherst. I'm also very grateful for the Vermont Humanities Council for sponsoring these lectures, and for our fundraising arm to help support it, which is the Friends of Brooks Memorial Library. And Mary Ide, the president, has a little PowerPoint presentation to my left with our sponsors, who I'll mention later. Just how valuable is the First Wednesday lecture series to our community? Since 2005, we've had some 72 talks with an attendance total that have exceeded 8,800 people. So I feel by the end of this season, we'll be close to 10,000. So that's a great, that's almost the population of Brattleboro. So I'm also thankful for the other sponsors who have been generous with their funds: the Brattleboro Camera Club, Brattleboro Retreat, Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Downs Racklin Martin, New Chapter, and the Wyndham World Affairs Council. And our statewide sponsors this year for the First Wednesday series: National Life Group Foundation and the Vermont Department of Libraries. And finally, I'd like to thank, for this lecture, The Legacy of Cesar Chavez, is the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Library Association, which supports Latino Americans' 500 Years of History program, which is part of an initiative called The Common Good, Humanities in the Public Square. And later this month, we have some flyers available. We'll continue to highlight Latino American immigrant experience with a 2-part film series. On Wednesday, October 28th, please join us for a screening and discussion of Latino Americans, Foreigners in Their Own Land. And on November 18th at 7 p.m., Latino Americans, Prejudice and Pride. Both film screenings will be in the meeting room and will be facilitated by Patricia Pedrosa Gonzalez from Keene State College. And as I mentioned, flyers are available. And then for next month, First Wednesday on November 4th, Dartmouth Professor Paul Whalen will be discussing Face-to-Face with the Emotional Brain. And there's a flyer for that out, so please pick that up as well. And please sign the register that'll be going around. And also, we have some feedback forms, and we use those forms to help us prepare for the next season. You can tell us what you'd like to see, any particular individuals, because we have the booklet available, and you can go through that booklet and survey the offerings and put it down on the feedback forms. So finally, to our speaker. Illan Stavans was at Brooks Library in December 2005, our first season. And he's returned in 2008 and 2012. So we have him sort of on a 3-year cycle, which has been good. He's an internationally known award-winning cultural critic, linguist, translator, public speaker, editor, short story writer, and TV host, whose best-selling work focuses on language, identity, politics, and history. Born in Mexico in 1961 into a Jewish family with roots in Eastern Europe, he was raised in a multilingual environment. Professor Stavans is the recipient of numerous awards, fellowships, and other honors, including an Emmy nomination, a Guggenheim Fellowship, the National Jewish Book Award, the Latino Hall of Fame Award, Chile's Presidential Medal, and several grants. He is the Lewis Sabring Professor of Latin American Latino Culture at Amherst College. His many books, and now get this, he was born in '61, 48 books under his belt, and I'm sure still going strong, includes Spanglish, The Making of a New American Language. He is also editor of An Organizer's Tale Speeches, the first major collection of writings by civil rights leader Cesar Chavez. Please welcome our Illan Stavans.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for the invitation to come back, and thank you. I want to start actually by saluting Vermonters in a number of ways. The most prominent to me at the start of this lecture is the fact that you have every first Wednesday the possibility of going to your libraries and talking about an assortment of topics with guests that come from the state and that come from the outside. For those of us who come from the outside, this is really an extraordinary opportunity to engage you and be engaged by you. And I spend an inordinate amount of time traveling and being in different states, and I don't know other states that do the same thing. Probably there are there, but if they are there, they don't have the beauty of Vermont and the spirit. It's wonderful to come back here and to talk about Cesar Chavez. Let me begin by that famous saying that everybody knows: you should live in interesting times. And indeed, I think we live in very interesting times today, certainly from the perspective of somebody who has followed the life and the legacy of Cesar Chavez. Who would have thought that in 2015 there would be a Latin American president, a Latin American pope, who, coming from Argentina, sympathizes with the poor, engages with topics that are dear to many of us and that connect with the roots of how society should be equal and free and engaged from the perspective of the Catholic Church. Who would have thought also that we would be coming at this point at the end of the second term of a president who is non-white. I always have a debate in my mind if this is the first black president or the first non-white president, and I think there's a significant difference between the two, who also started as an activist and who is engaged even at in the White House with topics that have to do with the grassroots, with engagement of the community. Just today, he and his cabinet announced that through Kickstarter, they were going to try to fund a campaign in order to help the refugees from Syria moving to different parts of Europe and to the United States. The concept for some of us might be foreign and it might be uncomfortable. The money from the government and by the government should probably be coming from other sources, but the idea there is quite an engaging one. The fact that we would be connecting with people ourselves giving money in order to change some of the themes and the problems that we see in society. And of course, we are in the middle of the first stage of a presidential campaign, probably the most buffoonish of all stages, and that looks closer to Comedy Central than to serious debate of ideas. And one of yours, Bernie Sanders, is getting a lot of attention to the happiness of many of us who are not from the state as well. Engaging with some of the ideas that Cesar Chavez played with, toyed around, and is famous for. Cesar Chavez died in 1993. When he died, close to 40,000 people attended his funeral. He was a national hero at that point. And from presidents to senators, from community leaders to religious figures, the appeal of Cesar Chavez at that time was enormous. On the other hand, it was a time, 1993, when the pendulum had shifted, had moved in the opposite direction. And some of the ideas that Cesar Chavez had been presenting to the American people had become passé, certainly in the White House or certainly in the political establishment. He was seen as an anachronism, no longer a person that spoke for the people and that came from them as well, but someone who had become a relic of the 1960s and the 1970s, not quite fitting with the transition that Latinos were making or supposedly making in the 1990s from the margins of society, from the working class to the middle class. There are other elements that are also challenging when one thinks of the funeral that took place in 1993 when Chavez died. And that is that in many ways he himself had outlived his legacy. He himself had become, if not the anachronism that some of the conservative Republican figures in the government and on the media were trying to portray, certainly someone who didn't seem to be as flexible anymore, as engaged with the type of spark that had inspired him when he was a young man. I will talk about this part of him having a somewhat or somehow lost connection with his own roots, with his own upbringing, toward the second part of my chat. And I want to prepare you that there are certain elements that might, in my view, seem accurate, but might also seem provocative to you. And I hope they are provocative, and I hope that I can engage you in a conversation about that type of anachronistic status that he had by the end of his life. Cesar Chavez was born in 1927, one of 10 children. His parents owned property in Arizona, and when he was very young, the federal government took away the property because of financial reasons connected with the family, and the family had to reinvent itself in many different ways. The father and mother both came from a Mexican background. They had been in the United States for a long period of time, but they still recognized their Mexican roots and saw themselves as connected, at least culturally, certainly religiously, to the type of tradition that was south of the border. This position of Cesar Chavez with and attracted to his Mexican background would become a topic both that would propel him to the national stage and would also become a source of conflict and the ambiguity inside him. Was he connected truly with Mexico? Did he relate to Mexicans as a population that was already expanding in the United States? What were his views on immigration in the 1960s and in the 1970s? And in what way did he cater or open up the doors to the type of a multifaceted, a pluralistic view of what Latino culture in the United States is today? I will also refer to those questions as I move on in my chat. His father had to immediately earn a living in order to support the family, and he started to pick to be a worker of the fields. And at the very beginning, having worked in Arizona, he moved to California, where most of the migrant workers were moving at that time, and where he found work picking lettuce and picking oranges, and sent a message to his wife that she should bring the entire family. And so the entire family moved from Arizona to California. Very early on, they kept on moving from one place to another. If you have a population here in Vermont, as we have in Massachusetts, of migrant workers that come from Guatemala or from El Salvador or from Honduras, you will know that many of the children often have to change schools, that they don't stay in the same location, and as a result, their education is choppy and interrupted. Cesar Chavez never went beyond 8th grade. He never entered high school, and by the time he finished 8th grade, he had changed schools 11 times. His concept of what the classroom was never one of solidity, of a place that he could relate to, that could feel as the equivalent of home or of a second home. And he did it not because he wasn't connected with the mind, the life of the mind, or because he wasn't interested in education, but because, as migrant workers did then, and as migrant workers do today, the family had to support itself, and it started with the father, and then slowly the various children would enter the trade, as the father would call it, and help support the family, and Cesar Chavez was one of them. He was known as a relatively timid, quiet young man that did not quite engage with the socially in the form of a leader. This is something that would eventually be transformed when he was in his late teens and his early 20s. Maybe one of the significant moments that happened to him is that having exhausted his energy going from one field to another, from the lettuce to the strawberries, and so on, he told his father and mother that he was going to join the army. He did, and he enlisted and was stationed in the Pacific. And at one point, coming back from service, he, in California, went to a movie theater with some of his friends, and he was told that he couldn't sit in a particular part of the theater because he was Mexican, that this place was reserved only for Americans, or on some occasion for Japanese. And that left him in a state of astonishment, of non-belief. And he, at that point, started to question the role that he had as an American, as a Mexican, and started to reflect together with his friends, what is it that Mexicans have or do not have in order to be part of the melting pot, in order to be part of what the United States is all about? And does he have that ticket the way anybody else or everybody else would have? What is the difference between the whites, and he would see it in racial terms, in ethnic terms, between the whites and the Mexicanos, or the Californios, Mexicans or Californios, and if there would ever come a time when Mexicanos would actually be recognized as equals compared to everybody else. After the service, he returned to California, and he met Helen, his future wife, with whom he would have 8 children. And he returned because of his father's falling sick to the trade in the family. Again, I put it in quotes, and started following once again with now his young family. He had 1 child, the harvest from one place to another. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't meant to be the speaker of his people. It was until the very early 50s, just one of the masses. And often leaders have this moment, well, many of us do, a moment of enlightenment, of revelation, when they see clearly what their own mission or their own responsibility ought to be. And as Cesar Chavez describes it, it was when picking together with many other Mexicanos in California, in Northern California, that one time a very thin man, very stolid, very determined, convinced, came in to where all the Mexicans were, the farm workers, and started talking to them about organizing. Chavez did not know anything about this band that had just arrived. He didn't even know anything about the idea of organizing. He thought that even though Mexicans had this unstable, never quite here status, that things were not going to change because migrant workers were, for the most part, transient. They didn't connect to a place. They didn't know the language. Most of them spoke Spanish, and they did not feel that they could come together as a community, even though as a community, they often came together when it had to do with funerals or births or Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead parties, festivities, and other major social gatherings. Didn't see the connection between one and the second until this man started speaking in public and started encouraging everybody in the community to organize and to become part of this socially tight group that would fight for their own betterment. His name was Fred Ross, and they immediately struck friendship between the two of them. Fred Ross was a legendary unionizer and an activist who went around mostly low income or transient labor environments and would bring ideas of organization in order to make people recognize that they had civil rights and that they could have a place of their own. Cesar Chavez had something that Fred Ross didn't have, and that was Spanish. Fred Ross wanted to communicate with the Mexican migrant workers. He was communicating in English, and for that very reason, even though his ideas were sound, they felt foreign. They felt alien. When they started to become friends, Cesar Chavez and Fred Ross, immediately the issue of language became decisive. And Fred Ross kept on telling Cesar Chavez that the fact that he had arrived to this place was only an accident, that he would leave, but he needed somebody there among the workers, one of the workers, to be able to communicate directly with their own people. And he started to encourage Cesar Chavez to have his own voice and to become that leader. Let me stop here for a second on the issue of language and of the issue of leadership and openness. There are three things that ultimately defined the life of Cesar Chavez. And not the three of them necessarily connect with what Fred Ross wanted an organizer to do. The first one, and that is indeed one that Fred Ross had instilled in him, was the idea of a strike. Strike as a mechanism by the workers in order to advance their own principles and to improve their own situation. Fred Ross had talked to Cesar Chavez about that, and Cesar Chavez had never thought that something like this would ever work with the migrant community, for the simple reason that he was convinced that the owners, the growers, would immediately replace the migrant workers with new ones that were coming, and as a result, any strategy that the organization would have would stumble and would not go too far. And yet, the idea that through a strike and through convincing not only the ones that were inside, but also the ones that would potentially become replacements for those that were inside, became so attractive to Cesar Chavez that he became convinced that he could engage the Mexican-American community with the idea of what in Spanish is called as la huelga, the strike. The second topic that was quite attractive to Cesar Chavez, that ultimately became one of his major messages, but one that did not come from Fred Ross, was the idea of nonviolence. At that time, and we're talking here about in 1951, Fred Ross met Cesar Chavez, and from 1951 to 1967, the astonishing odyssey of Cesar Chavez took place, from having been a timid, mostly quiet man to becoming a national hero. Only about 16 or 17 years, although it would prolong itself until the beginning of the 70s. Mainly from 51 to 67 or 68 were the major moments of that career. The idea of nonviolence obviously came from two figures that were very prominent at that time, not in the labor community, but at the international and the national stage. One of them clearly was the role of Martin Luther King Jr. and the idea that through civil disobedience and through resistance, but through nonviolence, the oppressed community could eventually assume its own voice and come to center stage and become what they had been refused to become. Cesar Chavez and the African American community had actually a very complicated relationship. Very often, Cesar Chavez would have a difficulty with unions that were mostly of African Americans, and this has to do with the ancestral racist aspect of the Mexican community in Mexico that had passed to the United States. And yet the figure of the Reverend Martin Luther King became a mesmerizing idol of sorts for him, and he started to absorb the idea that if the migrant workers were going to be able to resist the type of oppression that they were experiencing. It would be through two mechanisms. One mechanism, the strike, and the second mechanism, it would be nonviolence. He became ultimately one of the most important leaders at the world stage that advocated for this nonviolence, and one that would inspire figures that go from Bill Clinton to Barack Obama, both of whom have talked about how important it was that the mission of nonviolence wasn't only circumscribed to the African American struggle, to the black struggle for liberation, but it had to do also with the migrant workers of Mexican background. And the third very important element here that was a tool or a weapon for Cesar Chavez's transformation after the strike and after nonviolence as an ideology or as a strategy for change is the fast. The concept that the leader of a group, the leader of the community, becomes so connected with the community that he can put himself through a period of sacrifice and of renouncement of food and other earthly nutrients and connections in order for the entire community to be pushed forward. Cesar Chavez used the strategy of the hunger strike on a couple of occasions, and they were so significant that the entire United States was hooked to them through television, through radio, through major visits of Senator Robert Kennedy, for instance, of Loretta King, who, when he was fasting in order to provoke the change, would come to visit and give him support. The longest fast that Cesar Chavez had was of 27 days. He mostly only drank water, and his state, his fragile situation, became engagingly the topic of how the labor situation of the entire Mexican American population needed to change. I want to relate particularly the third strategy with an aspect of Cesar Chavez that I think is very important, and that connects with the Argentine Pope that we have today in the Vatican. Cesar Chavez was a deeply devout Catholic. He was Guadalupano, which is what Mexicans describe themselves. The Virgin de Guadalupe in Mexico is a religious figure that is larger in psychological and spiritual space than the figure of Jesus Christ itself. It is described as La Madre de Mexico, the mother of Mexicans, and the Mexicans, for that reason, consider themselves as Guadalupanos, the children of the Virgen de Guadalupe. In the very first movement for independence of Mexico in 1810, the equivalent of our George Washington was a priest by the name of Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, who led the first march for independence from Spain with not what would become the Mexican flag eventually, but with an icon, a flag that had the icon of the Virgin of Guadalupe. The Virgin of Guadalupe would appear countless other times in important struggles, both of the Mexican side and of the Mexican American side in the United States. And Cesar Chavez considered himself always a Guadalupano. He had the Virgin of Guadalupe as an icon in his office, in his house, and being a Catholic, he always considered the idea of sacrifice as an essential strategy. He said oftentimes that if you don't consider sacrifice, you should not get involved in leadership, and that the role of the church is to empathize with those that have not with those that have, and to do so by the priest relating immediately with them and leading the movement for transformation. You have to keep in mind also that in the 1960s, an important movement took place in Latin America. It is very crucial for the Pope we have right now, again, called the liberation theology, that brought the Catholic Church closer to the poor and convinced the priests that their role was that engagement with those that did not have, that were the dispossessed. For Cesar Chavez, the idea of having a hunger strike was intimately connected with the sacrifice that in Catholicism the image of Jesus Christ had done, and that leaders needed to be repeating time and again. And he always linked one and the other. He saw them as the continuity of your faith going into the workplace, and from the workplace to equality and freedom and justice. It's emblematic to me why most other ethnic communities in the United States to this day have recognized leaders, but the Latino community has very few or has none whatsoever. And I am very aware that I am here talking to you about, obviously, Cesar Chavez, probably the most important of Latino leaders of all time. And when the Massachusetts Humanities Council decides to do something on Latinos and on Latino leadership, the first name that comes to mind is the name of Cesar Chavez. In fact, if I invited you to think of any other Latino leader in the national stage, beyond that, in the international stage, that was of Latino background, I assume, and we could do this in the Q&A section, I assume that there would be you would have a very difficult time coming up with other names. And that has to do with a variety of reasons. I'm talking here of figures that have transcended the local, even have transcended the stage, and have become national. I'm going to come back to the elections that we're living through right now. And that is because one of the suggestions that I here have for you is that Latinos in the United States today, close to 60 million. 60 million is an enormous amount of people. There are more Latinos in the United States than Spaniards in Spain. There are more Latinos in the United States than people in most Latin American countries where the ancestors of those Latinos come from. There are more Latinos in the United States than Canadians in Canada, too. Latinos have actually become a kind of new nation, new Latin American nation, but within the United States. Roughly, out of every 10 Latinos in the United States, there are between 7 and 8 Mexicans, and the rest is Dominicans, Cubans, Colombians, Argentines, etc. Or maybe one can include also here Puerto Ricans. But the question here with Puerto Ricans is that it's always a difficult dilemma to figure out. Is Puerto Rico part of the United States or is it part of Latin America? It's a commonwealth, meaning in Spanish it's known Estado Libre Asociado, which means free associated state. Doesn't make much sense, either you're free or you're associated. And Latin Americans sometimes include Puerto Ricans in the Latino melting pot, and sometimes do not because we see them as part of the United States. 60 million Latinos in the United States, and I would suggest to you that on the other hand, there is not one single Latino in the United States, not one. And that is because the term Latino has become quite popular. It used to be Hispanic, and before that it used to be Latin, or it used to be the Spanish-speaking people in the United States, or it would be the Spanish people in the United States. We have a number of different ways in the English language to describe this large population, but all of these descriptions suggest that the population is somewhat homogeneous, that speaks the same language, that comes from the same background, and that understands itself as part of a single community. All of which is true, and all of which is not true. It's true because, with the exception of Brazil, which is the largest Latin American country, and probably the biggest island in the world, in metaphorical terms, because it speaks Portuguese, it doesn't quite ever fit into the Latin American paradigm. Everybody else speaks Spanish. And yet, everybody else has also a different kind of history. We have, in the same room, when you put an Argentine with a Mexican, or a Colombian with a Venezuelan, or an Ecuadorian with a Costa Rican, the first thing is that we're going to do is start feeling as if we're part of the same group, crack some jokes, and often even talk about the words that in one country are understood in one particular way, that in another country are understood in a very different way. And often they are sexual words, words that have to do with sexual parts. But 10 minutes later, that same group is going to start fragmenting into the Colombians on one side and the Mexicans on the other and the Nicaraguans, etc. Because these are groups that, although united, also come from very different traditions, national traditions, religious traditions, cultural traditions, sometimes even linguistic traditions. And so if you ask Cuban Americans today in Miami if they feel any connection whatsoever with Chavez, they will tell you yes, Hugo Chavez, but not Cesar Chavez. And the connection they have with Hugo Chavez is that they hate him the way they hate Fidel Castro, because he emblematizes the communism and the Cold War of the 60s. And the same thing happens with Cesar Chavez. They see him as a relic of the 60s, connected with communism, connected with a type of Mexican subversion that spoke in no way whatsoever to the Cuban-American dilemma in the United States. And if you ask Puerto Ricans the same question, very often you will hear it, that Cesar Chavez is a Mexican leader, but not a Puerto Rican leader. He doesn't speak for the Latino community. And so here I am suggesting to you that even though we Latinos are proud of being Latinos, we also know that Latinidad or Latino-ness is a very complex, very heterogeneous, and often fractured umbrella term that for purposes of power might result in some benefits, but also might result in some infights. And there's much that one can say about that. Maybe in the Q&A section we can explore it more. But the result of it is that a figure like Cesar Chavez, that speaks for, as I was telling you, 7 or 9 or 8 out of this 10 Latinos in the United States, not often will speak for all the Mexicans, because there's a new generation that doesn't feel connected with him anymore, and will not also speak necessarily to those that come from different national backgrounds, certainly other religious backgrounds among the Latino population. The question to me, however, is Cesar Chavez a religious or a political or an ideological leader that has the national status that is the equivalent of somebody like Malcolm X or somebody like Martin Luther King? And I'm very ambivalent about this, very ambivalent. I travel often to California, where there are or the Southwest, where almost every city has a big boulevard called the Cesar Chavez Boulevard or the Cesar Chavez Avenue. Almost every town where there are Mexicans, there are schools called the Cesar Chavez School or the Cesar Chavez Community Center. He is one of the first Latinos to have his own stamp in the U.S. Postal Service, posters, coffee mugs, etc. But how many of the young in this country know about the words of Cesar Chavez and know what Cesar Chavez was about? And to what extent a figure like Martin Luther King, who is undoubtedly a kind of redeeming voice in the way we understand the 60s feels like someone where Cesar Chavez could even come close to. It seems to me that we are not there, not yet there, and maybe will not be there. Why? Maybe because we see the 60s as the struggle between black and white. Maybe because diversity has only come recently, and we don't think that the civil rights era was an era where Puerto Ricans and Filipinos and Mexicans also participated and marched and were engaged in civil rights. Mostly what we hear in the media, PBS in particular, is that this civil rights era, the debacle was about the black transformation and how the upheaval went against the white establishment. But there was a lot going on in the Southwest that had to do with other colors, other races, where we hardly ever feel it. I have a big qualm with PBS because PBS, it seems to me, that only brings Latino topics when it feels like a token, never fully integrating them to the larger spectrum of what the United States is about. They are secluded into the Hispanic or Latino History Month or Latino Heritage Month. There's nothing worse to me than having a month in the year. It's kind of reinventing the ghetto in the calendar. You put it only in that 4 weeks in order to forget about it in the other 11 months. Two ideas here that I hope will provoke you, as I promised. One, and they are intimately related. One of them is that the figures of the 60s that we remember as martyrs, as transforming figures, died in the process of their own liberation. And the ones we tend to forget are the ones that survived their own image and their own legacy. This is not to tell you that I wished that Cesar Chavez's life would have been different. But he came to a time when everybody was already moving away from the civil rights atmosphere of the 1960s and 70s. In the 80s, where the first Bush and Reagan and the whole vision of looking at government in different ways, of looking at the middle class under a different rubric, where Cesar Chavez became a kind of voiceless figure. He kept on trying to reinvent himself. He went from fighting against the terrible conditions of migrant workers to engaging against pesticides. He went against the idea that it was only Mexican Americans that he was representing, and he tried to expand his base to other groups, many of which really didn't feel connected with him anymore as a leader. And mostly, he started to become a nepotist, meaning that instead of allowing his own legacy to become fluid and bring young people into the movement with bright, new, fresh ideas, he started to protect mostly his children and the friends of his children. And he gave them positions of responsibility in the United Farm Workers Union that he had mainly orchestrated to be brought into the national sphere, and into what would eventually become the Cesar Chavez Foundation, which is the one in charge of sustaining his legacy and pushing it forward. There is no foundation or no institution connected with Cesar Chavez today that is not infighting and literally falling apart. You can't request permission to reprint a speech by Cesar Chavez because so many of the children are fighting among each other that you never get an answer. And I can tell you, having been one of the lucky ones before they started fighting so intensely, that got a break and was allowed to publish some of this. They have become fractured to such a degree that Some of the children say that they are the representatives of the Cesar Chavez legacy, and the other ones claim something similar, and they don't speak to one another. And so what is happening here is that the legacy of Cesar Chavez is one that, in my own vision of things, has kind of been fossilized. We have him as a stamp. We have him as a school. We have him as a boulevard. But we don't have his ideas in any organic way engaged with the next generation of Latinos. The next generation of Latinos or other groups do not feel compelled to read his speeches, to connect with the way he saw the world, and to feel that they are the ones that are going to be carrying on that legacy. When somebody like Julian Castro, who is one of the Castro brothers, who is a promising democratic figure that ultimately, I can assure you, will run for office, and arguably could become or come as close as possible to being the first Latino president, wants to find his own roots as an organizer or with his own people. The name of Cesar Chavez most often comes just in passing. But it's easier for somebody like Julian Castro to go to Martin Luther King or even to Mahatma Gandhi than to go to Cesar Chavez. Such is the kind of static, non-organic way in which Cesar Chavez sits right now, in my view, in the American psyche. I like that my kids in school had to have 2 pages of their textbook on Cesar Chavez. 2 pages is better than nothing. But those 2 pages felt like a Wikipedia entry, just listing when the first hunger strike had taken place, when the march in Delano had occurred, etc., rather than trying to engage with his vision in a way that younger people would engage. And so I come back to the question of living in interesting times. The Latino community is at the cusp right now of finally entering the middle class. We have taken a long time in this transition. The Latinos are today the largest ethnic group. It is constantly debated the extent to which Latinos can decide who the next president of the United States is, if all of us are going to vote for one or are going to be fractured and fragmented in the act of voting. And we are also at a time in which the question of diversity in the United States has become so much more ingrained, and where we have figures that have broken the glass ceiling. The first black or non-white president finally in the White House, a prominent Democrat, a woman running for office, and also a prominent one on the Republican side, and maybe the issue of the legacy of feminism finally pushing forward to a new transformation. And the question here is, where do we Latinos sit in all this? Not only are we the largest group, but we are the most media powerful. We have 2 television networks that command enormous attention, Univision and Telemundo. We have figures like Jorge Ramos, who, even though he is the newscaster of one of the shows, can become an activist on television, standing up to Donald Trump and talking about the future of Spanish in the United States in ways that a political leader of Latino background does not do in the media. We are also at a time when it is clear that our history has to go beyond 2 pages in the textbooks of my kids in school. That Latino history cannot be a month of the year. That this is something that has to be much more integrated. And that Latinos need to find their own voice and present it to the rest of Americans and say, we are part of what the country is, you are part of us, and we need to engage one another. And the question in all this to me is going to be, what of Latino history is going to be rescued? What is going to be passed to the future for generations to understand? And I hope there is much that needs to pass. There is, and I've spent my life trying to write books and give talks about the diversity of the Latino community. There's much to be said about the complexity of having been here before the United States started in the Southwest, of having a language that is already the unofficial second language of the country, that our connection with different parts like Florida or Chicago or Texas or California or New York are so complex as to be impossible to take out the Latino component in order to understand fully what those states are about. I hope that in all this, there is going to be a revamping, an attempt to understand more organically who Cesar Chavez is. It seems to me that at one point, there needs to come a generation of younger people who are going to look at what he said, at what he spoke, at the challenges he faced, and are going to see there an imperfect leader, a leader who had to make a number of choices, some of which were extraordinary. He was the first Latino to really receive public attention, and some of which were not as sound as they could have been. Still, a figure that brought the Latino population, whatever we understand by Latino in the 1960s and in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s, as forward, and created connections with other groups. But only if we see that imperfection, only if we understand the challenges that he faced and the challenges that we face, are we going to be able to finally come to terms with a leader that opened a lot of doors, but not always helped the future generations pass through them. Let me conclude with one more topic. I have been very fortunate to spend a lot of time editing the words of Cesar Chavez that are mostly in letters, in transcripts, in interviews, in speeches that are stored in Detroit, and that are just like the Cesar Chavez Foundation and the United Farm Workers Union in a state of disarray, very poorly administered. The book that I put together, is literally only a fraction of the amount that is to be found in his archives. Many letters that have not been made public, many speeches, numerous drafts of which are to be found there, corrected in the rewritten for a number of different occasions. When a generation of scholars finally makes it there and opens up more that archive, I think we're going to see something that is still awaiting to be seen. And we're going to see something, I think, that is quite interesting. Whereas the Reverend Martin Luther King had an advanced degree and was a very eloquent writer and an astonishingly powerful speaker. In the case of Cesar Chavez, this is a man who didn't go to high school, who could hardly write when he started to organize. And many of his speeches are co-written with ghostwriters, with figures of the union, with friends. And it's sometimes hard to know exactly what are the words of Cesar Chavez and what are the words of the other ones that came in. Even in his letters, he would dictate them to his lawyers or to his closest allies. And I am fascinated by the legacy of Cesar Chavez in terms of words. being a man who opened the Spanish language to the workers, left very little that was in Spanish. He could not write in Spanish. And when he left something in English, we know that in most cases, it wasn't directly written by him. And so here we have what it seems to me an added complication of what the legacy of Cesar Chavez is. What was he, what was his, and what was from others that belongs to us? Sometimes to me it's easier to see Cesar Chavez delivering a speech in public in front of the Harvard graduating class, or in front of the United Farm Workers, or the auto workers, in improvising his words, and sitting down later on and transcribing those words. Those are the words of Cesar Chavez, than the speeches that were written down by somebody else that have this filtered alternative voice that is there. And so I finish, my friends, thanking you again for making a library a place for debating ideas. I leave you with a question of what happens to a leader that outlives his own legacy, that becomes a statue or a stamp or a school, dusty, yet celebrated by young kids, but those that become young in their 20s and 30s don't quite connect with him as an inspiration anymore. A leader who, because of his dexterity, because of his improvisation, could mesmerize an audience by improvising words, but what we have left is in written form, and most of which is not coming directly from him. And a leader that is Latino at a time when the concept of Latino is so inclusive as to become almost non-existent, that can speak to 60 million people that often feel as a group, but often feel also that we are conveniently part of this group. At a time when many of his words engage with the poor, the church should connect with transformation. We need to be active in bringing equality and justice. Have finally made it to the White House, have finally made it to the Vatican. Some, like Cesar Chavez, a cornerstone in bringing those words to the White House, to the Vatican, seem to be eclipsed, seem to be forgotten. His words overwritten by others. Thank you.
Thank you again, Illan, for such an inspiring, informative lecture.
If there are questions or comments or reactions or, discomforts, please.
Hi, my name is Shauna, and I grew up in California in the 60s. And so my perspective, I didn't hear it, so I want to add it.
Sure.
And that is that I would argue that he has a great legacy in two regards. One is part of his movement was to have a boycott. And to this day, I don't eat a grape without thinking about who picked that grape. And the boycott went on for months and affected whole supermarket chains in California. And I would add that I wasn't so aware of the civil rights movement going on, but I was definitely aware. It was in the air and the water in California that there was a movement of farm workers. So you couldn't avoid knowing that. And then the other legacy is that of the feminists in the Hispanic culture. You asked, who are other leaders? Well, Dolores Huerta is still very active. And she walked side by him. I don't know, their dynamics, I think, was conflicted.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to me, they were both heroes. So, and I thought of, as you were speaking, a difference between leaders and heroes.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's why he's on a stamp.
Good. Thank you very much for adding that perspective. I like the two words very much, bringing the two words leader and hero. And maybe it is right there where you have those different levels. Yeah, and I thank you also very much for bringing the name of Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta was a very significant figure in the Chicano movement that walked with him and was crucial in bringing, together with other women, the voice of the female side of the group. Cesar Chavez was often criticized for leaving to Dolores to do the side of connecting with the women. And she and Cesar had this difficult relationship between the two because often she felt that he was only doing it partially or through her. He wrote a couple of essays, a couple of speeches about the role of women, but the recent scholarship that has been done in the last maybe 10 or 15 years by mostly Chicana scholars looks at the Chicano movement as ultimately a very macho movement that incorporated elements that the Mexican Revolution had initiated of women participating in political marches and boycotts and activism, but didn't live up to its mission or its goal. Dolores Huerta, as you said, she's absolutely active today. She gives speeches, she visits campuses, and she is often seen in the media joining important moments of the day. She is another figure that connects with that movement of the 60s of the Chicano movement, and who is also sometimes criticized during inside the Latino community for being more connected with the past than connected with the present. Although I'm not convinced that that is the case. I think young Chicanas, particularly on campus, feel very connected with Dolores Huerta. So I thank you for bringing this other side.
Illan, the second film in the series on November 18th, Prejudice and Pride, will feature Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. So,
And there
keep
is
that in
a
mind.
book, Shana? There is a book coming, I think was just published, of the speeches of Dolores Huerta, which I myself am very much looking forward to reading.
I'm confused in a way, or wondering, because to me, his legacy is much more so in the labor movement than in a specific Hispanic, and that I think is relevant because, and I'm not really well read, but I think Juan Gonzalez addresses the diversity of the what people are trying to umbrella as the Latino community as a political force. I'm not sure that that is something that is going to work, but for me, his legacy is labor, and I'm curious to know how the young people, if young people in the labor movement are connecting with him, because he's certainly, in my view, I tend not to think him as Latino or Mexican, but as a very
labor
powerful labor.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what you say about that.
Very
Thank
good
you.
question. I have often seen him at the crossroads of those two traditions. On the one side, the tradition of his national and ethnic background, which I have been stressing, and which is mainly the focus that I presented today. The side of him having connected with the Catholic Church, him having connected with the Mexican tradition, and how he relates or doesn't relate to other Latinos. But and the other one that is essential is the one of the labor, the one that you're presenting. To the degree that he is relevant today, I believe that he is seen as a major figure of the 60s. But my knowledge of the current constellation of icons in the labor movement is somewhat limited, I must say. I don't believe that he goes beyond that in that movement. Again, assuming the limited information that I have, I believe that he's mostly seen as a figure that was very active in the Chicano movement of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, that is part of the civil rights movement, and whose ideas not necessarily pass on to the next generation. But I would say that it would be better for a labor leader today to speak to that, and would be probably more connected and eloquent than I would be in that realm.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm very interested in Che Guevara
Yeah.
and his evolving personhood. Is there modern scholarship underway now to sort of resurrect him from the military guerrilla to the real Latino leader that did a lot of good?
Yeah. There was a book published maybe 5 years ago that tries to do exactly what you say, tries to understand Che Guevara not as the man who was connected with looking for the entire continent of the Americas, who went on a motorcycle ride in order to find his own roots, and ultimately connected with Fidel Castro and was in Sierra Maestra and died in Bolivia, but a man that passes on. And the argument that the book makes is not unlike the argument that I have been making about Cesar Chavez, that he has become an icon in a watch or in a movie or in T-shirts, but not necessarily a figure that is organically understood. I believe that the change that is happening right now between the US and Cuba, the opening up and the transformation of Cuba as a sore point in US Latin American relations, and ultimately the opening up of Cuba to a new infusion of life, whatever that infusion is going to be about, that is going to bring us to understand some of the leaders of the 60s, and Che Guevara probably a leading one under a different light. I don't think it's going to be happening right away. We will have to live through there's going to be a shake in the moment that companies start arriving in Havana, opening up, communism starts receding, some of the Miami Cubans start trying to buy property. There's going to be a lot that is going to obfuscate what Fidel Castro and communism and Che Guevara were all about. So my prediction is that it's going to take a couple of decades for us to see Che Guevara under a different light. My view is, connecting it with what Shanna was mentioning and also what the lady explored right now, is that we're still understanding the 60s. For me, the crucial dilemma is that the 60s seem to me to be understood as a mostly black and white debacle, where Latinos played a very limited role, and I'm here bringing back not the labor but the ethnic side, and we have not been able to articulate a better understanding of our leaders coming out from that time, passing them on to the next generation. I believe that will happen, but I think it's going to take a while, and I think Che Guevara is. Let me see if I could. Let me add a thought here. I found it fascinating that when the Pope visited Cuba, before coming to the United States, there was a photograph taken by Fidel's son of him, the Pope with Fidel. I don't know if you saw it, but Fidel had an Adidas jacket, which it seems to me, I don't know if anybody paid attention to it, but Fidel did everything in his youth to get all that capitalist iconography out of Cuba. And the thing that you see in front of the Pope is an Adidas kind of sweatshirt, which, you know, and he's, maybe all of us in our old age do things that, it seems that, for me, that is what has happened to Fidel Castro in that sense is very much what has happened to Che Guevara. Che Guevara is seen in Cuba as a huge hero and seen in the West as a capitalist item of rebellion. You put it on t-shirts among the young, it sells well, sells very well. The question is, can you see him in the middle? Can you see a more complex figure in the middle? And that, I think, takes more time and more commitment. And I don't think we are there yet as a society to see the complexity of those characters.
So I thank you so much, and thank you to everyone that has participated. I don't know if I have a question. I just, all the time I'm motivated to really see society as it is, and I seriously don't understand why we need to still needing heroes and leaders and blah, 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 when we know very well that all of us is how we keep the movement. And so in that sense, I think that I take whatever opportunity to try to do it. And so in that sense, it's like, hopefully, as I see some beautiful young faces here, but I'm sorry, the most of us are adults. And so I don't know how we will continue teaching the history of labor in this country. I think that it's fundamental. And in fact, I would love to see, yes, I am so happy to hear that it's considered a legacy in the labor movement, because I believe that. And also the diversity in the United States. In fact, if you're in California, has a lot of sense to be Chicana. Mm-hmm. I live in New Hampshire, I'm Mexican, I'm sorry, has no sense. Has no sense. And so the diversity in this huge geography in itself, there are different nations there. And so why we need more leaders, why we still believe in, because in this society, it has been proven. It has been proven that everything becomes a souvenir. So we can keep collecting souvenirs, and anyway, we're not changing. And I think that the Latino umbrella, which in reality is very complicated and very complex, but to me it's the wonderful opportunity to discuss about class issues, because again, and believe me, I loved your lecture, but we still needing, like, a person is educated. And I don't know how you have done 48 books, good for you, but it's like, why? Why we need still, because in my impression, coming as a migrant to this country, of course, even in Mexico, before coming here, I knew who was Martin Luther King. I don't see any change in racism in this country. And even living in New Hampshire, people were even so upset that Obama is an educated man and articulated. Even just they hated that. Even just they hated that the man is a gentleman. It's something there about the painful legacy of racism in this country that yes, and so it's very weird, in fact, to have the months. At the beginning, I never understood, later clearly understood. Now I'm very honest, I use the months because it's the only way to address my students, it's the only way to approach them. Yeah. So now I said, okay, in navigating with the system, what kind of flexibility we engage. But for me, I do the Black History Month seriously because it's everything that people really hear. Probably I can insert some things. In fact, the Latino Month, whoever we are, depending. I don't do in New Hampshire. I do few things. We don't celebrate Cinco de Mayo in Mexico, and so, but even now I'm doing some things about Cinco de Mayo. So it's like that flexibility, and yes, as the US is not ready for Latinos. So it's not ready, seriously, and it's so complicated, but in fact, this massive group, we need to do something, because linguistically, economically, Latinos is an excellent souvenir. In fact, is the group that sells more right now. And so economically, it's cool to be Latino. It's so cool to be Latino. but we know very well that there are some leaders in economical powers that are playing this while the class movement in the United States is back. So these stereotypes, like I said to my students, the reason that I need to repeat you that whiteness is an ethnicity is because you forget that there are white people who are very poor. And so it's like, we'll continue navigating.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Well, there are so many things that you said that could be, why do we need leaders? Why do we need new leaders? Well, I differ with you. We need new leaders. We need visionaries that help us change. But I also believe that, as Obama stated in his first campaign, we are the leaders we're waiting for. I agree with you. Maybe the United States is not ready for Latinos, but the United States is with the Latinos and Latinos. So either yes or no. This is. I believe that we're witnessing a Hispanization of this country, and it needs to be done organically. It needs to be done from coast to coast, from north to south, in a way that doesn't break the whole thing, but brings us together. It's true that it's cool and hot to be Latino. It's also very uncool to be Latino right now. The tension against immigration is enormous. You hear it with figures like Donald Trump that satanizes Latinos as Mexicans, as all rapists, and what else he said? I don't know. The irony is that Donald Trump has been a very useful figure for the Latino community. I see Latinos coming together because of Donald Trump in a way. So there you have it. You need leaders, for better or worse. Just one last thought. Cesar Chavez is absolutely unknown in Mexico.
I know.
Absolutely
I
unknown.
know.
Yeah, and you, yeah, which is fascinating.
And maybe the answer to my question is to read your book, but what I haven't heard from you is, what are Cesar Chavez's thoughts? And are they thoughts that, for somebody who's not going to read the book, can somehow
Sure. I have tried
be
to
expressed?
Sure, I have tried to deliver those thoughts, but in different words. But let me quote him: "The rich have money, the poor have time. Without sacrifice, there's no clear vision for the future. A life of frustration is a life that can lead to transformation. The picket line is a beautiful place. It shows us where we stand. The church needs to be with us, not against us. I sacrifice for my people. I am my people." Those are some of the quotes.
You mentioned lack of Hispanic leaders, and for me, what comes to mind is the man who recently is going to be beatified by the Pope, Oscar Romero, from El Salvador.
Okay. What I meant here is Latino leaders, meaning U.S. Latinos, people in the United States, born in the United States, who are leaders. There are plenty of leaders in Latin America. Latin America has 450 million people, and we could make right now an enormous galaxy of names that are crucial in the history of Latin America. What I was meaning is, for the 60 million Latinos that live north of the Rio Grande, the leaders that represent them, that is where we have found corruption, limitation, nepotism, and lack of representation. Arnulfo Romero is crucial figure in Latin America, in Central America, and very much connected with Pope Francis in his view of liberation theology, of how the church has to be connected with the people. And like Arnulfo Romero, the Pope just beatified Junípero Serra, a figure in the United States that also was about evangelizing the indigenous population in the Southwest. But that was very controversial because that evangelical approach also meant colonizing and taking away the native languages and taking away the native cultures. What I meant here is, I'm talking about, there's a difference between Latin Americans and Latinos, at least in terminology. When we talk about Latin Americans, we talk of the people that live from Mexico to Argentina, and Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic. When we talk about Latinos these days, we're talking about Hispanic people that live in the United States, that were born in the United States or that immigrated in one way or another. And that is where I feel, and I refer to the scarcity of icons. But I think that's what was saying there, between heroes and leaders, there's an interesting correlation. Thank you very much. Thank you.